We've come to the last lecture, and we're talking about temporary water bodies. So I want to spend some time um, because on temporary water bodies because I think they're oftentimes really ignored. Um, I use the word water bodies because I don't really want to use the term wetland because there's a lot of systems that are not what I would call a wetland, but are definitely water bodies that hold water and have biological processes that go on. What I do want to say is that phytotelmata, which are like bromeliads or little water holes in trees, are relatively well studied, but that's the only type of temporary water bodies that are well studied. So how do we define a temporary water body, right? Whether we're talking about a natural or an artificial system, I want to talk about it as a water body which experiences a recurrent dry phase. What I mean by that is the dry phase is normal, right? So whether this is a rain, thunderstorm-driven wetland that fills up with water when thunderstorms come by, or a temporary wetland that we have around here in Wisconsin that fills up with water after the snow melt and maybe dries up by June or July or something. So, but we're thinking, from small scale little pitcher plants, tires full of water, trees, but also bromeliads, but also, typical wetlands. We usually call them, sometimes people call them vernal pools. What vernal pool is actually referring to is a very predictably wet and dry season. So in California has this Mediterranean climate where you have rainy winters and hot, dry summers. What you get then are these vernal pools that predictably fill up every winter with water and every summer are dry. If you go to the Great Plains, where I've done a lot of my work, this is me in a wetland, what's called a playa wetland or a playa lake, and these are a lot more stochastic, where this was one of my summers where I was just collecting dirt. Some of these vernal pools can be salty, some of them can be fresh depending on the water source and how long and how concentrated that water gets. Sometimes it can start out as fresh and get salty as the water evaporates and gets more concentrated. So when a lot of people think of these systems as very highly disturbed systems, right? How do you define disturbance, though, in an ecological sense, is a temporary change in environmental conditions that cause a pronounced change in an ecosystem, or a change that results in the removal of large amounts of biomass. So like a forest fire here removes a lot of biomass. A river drying out or a wetland drying out certainly causes a pronounced change in the ecosystem. But I want to know, what is disturbance in a temporary water body? Is it, if it's predictable, if we know of a temporary pond or a vernal pool, all the organisms there essentially plan, and I put that in quotes because they know that the water is going to go away and their life cycle is designed around that, they are going to definitely, is that a disturbance, right? Is it a temporary change even though it happens every single year? So just when we think about disturbance, it's a little tricky issue when we're thinking about temporary wetlands. So why study temporary water bodies? Well, they are common. They are the most numerous aquatic habitat by far. They contribute to global biodiversity. They oftentimes are dispersal routes for a lot of organisms. They are places that have a lot of diseases, and they're also really convenient study sites because they are short-lived systems with not that many organisms living in them. So this is a picture out of an apartment that I used to live at, and we can see this is right after a rainstorm. I have a temporary water body right here. I have a temporary water body in the bucket that I was collecting water for the plants that I was using. On my chair, I had a little spot of water that would pick up it was colonized by algae in this little pot that I forgot to drain, had a bunch of water in it, and there was little things growing in there because I chucked it out, right? So when we think about the distribution of wetlands, this isn't really fair. This whole map should be covered in wetlands, because there are temporary wetlands in every little place. there's lots of really unique diversity in temporary water that a lot of people don't see. So what I mean by that is two meanings: by species diversity, how we generally think about it, but the organisms themselves have very different strategies and are living very different lives compared to organisms that are living in temporary water. So there's plenty of prokaryotes and protists that are pretty much all wholly understudied, unknown. You could go to a temporary water body and pick up, a milliliter of water, a milliliter of sediment, and find a bunch of undescribed species there. The plants then show really interesting patterns because the plants need to be very, very plastic, meaning flexible in their physiology. They need to withstand prolonged submergence, but they also need to withstand really potentially long times without any water. So what we generally see is up in the uplands you have more terrestrial plants and the most aquatic plants down in, because they're going to have water the most. These would have the most adaptations to living in a truly aquatic environment. And what you see then drives what plants can live where is the distribution of standing water in time and in space. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, water up here is going to be, the wetland itself will be wet and having, not having those anoxic sediments for just a little bit of time, but down here it might be potentially for the majority of the year or a lot of time. So what you get is this banding pattern. These are California vernal pools that have these particular bands of flowers of different colors. We have yellow flowers here, blue flowers here, green, and then here's the water that's left over. Even in the dry system you can see distinct bands, and based on, these are flowers that require a specific amount of water, like more water, and that's where they dominate. Whereas these flowers will be a different species that require a certain amount of water, like less water basically. So you get these really cool banding patterns in the vernal pools, and at least in the very predictable vernal pools. On the animal side, you find a lot of really cool invertebrates. One of the most common species that we see dominating these temporary ecosystems are brachiopods. Brachiopods being fairy shrimp, clam shrimp, and tadpole shrimp. They're some of my favorite things. They're really, the classic hallmark taxa that we find in these temporary water bodies. And one of the things that they're all have in common is that the eggs require a dry period. Without a dry period, the eggs won't hatch out. And they have this really indeterminate growth, meaning they will continue to grow through as long as they can, because the bigger they are, the more eggs that they produce. And this shouldn't be a line, it should really be more of a exponential kind of curve. And they'll really, when they hatch out, they take cues based on the salinity, the depth of water, and then how crowded they are with their neighbors. So in the early hydro period, there's a bunch of water. The water is really fresh, it's really deep, and they don't come across each other very often. So they continue to grow to try to get as big as they can, so they can release the biggest amount of eggs. Then later on in the hydro period, as the water starts to get a little saltier, the depth goes down, they start bumping into each other more, they switch over, no longer growing, and putting all their energy into creating eggs. And they'll create egg sacs and egg sacs and egg sacs for as long as they can. Interestingly though, so think about maybe a given year where there's a thunderstorm, dumps a bunch of water, fills up the wetland, and maybe it doesn't fill it up that much. So they'll grow as much as they can, but they'll only get to be relatively small, and then the water starts to go away. Well, they'll create a certain amount of eggs, but then if another thunderstorm comes by and dumps, they'll all of a sudden the water will go back to being really fresh and deep, and they'll sense that and stop putting energy into eggs and go back to growing, because the more they can grow, then the farther over they can be on this body size chart, which then puts them up more eggs that they will produce. And the hatching requirements then for these eggs are extremely specific, okay? And very few of the eggs will hatch out each time, and it's really tied to the precipitation regime. So the chance of so there's oftentimes abortive hatches, where this is where eggs will hatch out because they get wet, but there wouldn't have been enough water in the wetland for the eggs to actually grow and complete their life cycle. So, there might only be water for 3 days and then they hatch out. That's not enough time for these fairy shrimp to actually create any eggs. But what we see, though, is the number of eggs that hatch out is tied to how often the water fills and has enough water to actually have the full life cycle. Okay, so let's say you need 2 weeks of water, and if a wetland has half of the rainfalls has at least 2 weeks of water, on average what you find is about half of the eggs will hatch. But you take the same species, put them in a different pond that only fills up for 2 weeks, has water for 2 weeks only about 10% of the time. In a rainfall event, you only have 10% of the eggs hatching. They can be the same species, and they can interbreed, but they'll have different hatching regimes, which is really interesting. Also, bird ingestion can also increase hatching rate. We're not really sure why that happens yet. So how do these eggs then get around? So what they do is they, as the wetlands dry out, the sediments are oftentimes very windblown and mobile and can be blown around and blown all over the environment. They can be an animal feed. As you can imagine, this little killdeer that's going through looking for fairy shrimp to eat, that mud gets attached to the killdeer, could get attached to this cow, right? And my boots, I'm sure that they were attached to my boots, and I was a vector for dispersal when I have been working in these wetlands. What we see is a really interesting priority effect, where ponds that are very close to each other will actually have very different types of communities, even though their chemical conditions are the same. There's the same type of habitat. It's just whatever eggs got to there first and now outcompete the other eggs, any other eggs that come in now. These eggs for these brachiopods are amazing. They are extremely resistant to high temperatures, most chemicals. You can take them to space. You can shine UV radiation on them. And there's actually thought that there might be some DNA repair mechanisms that go along during the eggs while they're dried out. You can take eggs from Great Salt Lake and dig way down deep in the sediments of Great Salt Lake, and you can hatch out their eggs. They're 30,000 years old, and the eggs will still be viable. They're crazy how resistant they are. And this is one of the ways that a lot of these organisms will be able to survive this dry period. So estivation, torpor, dormancy, all sorts of suspension of biological processes, lots of different words that mean slightly different things. I don't really need to get into them. But a lot of these mechanisms are not fully understood how they work. But what's interesting is we oftentimes have this a really good idea that there's seed banks. There are plants that can last for potentially decades in the sediments, and then you get a wetland filling event and a hydro period, and you get plants that you never knew you had before coming out. But the same thing happens with invertebrates. So the first thing we see is resistance of how one way that organisms really can survive these dry periods is with resistance. And the great way to think about this is tardigrades. They were originally discovered by Germans, kleiner Wasserbars, which means small water bear. And when they dry out, so this is what they look like. This is scanning electron microscope. This is through a light microscope. And when they dry out, they turn into this little anhydrobiotic stage, and you can do just about anything to them. You can put them at absolute zero. You can boil them, put them in hotter than boiling water, super high pressures, vacuum, radiation, all sorts of different things, and they're very, very resistant. Lungfish are another example here, where the adults, they'll be in these wetland areas. When the water starts to go away, they burrow into the sediment, secrete this mucus layer, and can survive in these, curled up in these little mud pockets for potentially a decade or so. Check out a video, I'll put a link in the description. So that's like resistance, right? Where organisms will really be able to withstand and tolerate the dry system. Whereas the brachiopods do something called resistance, where they bounce back, where the adults really aren't there throughout the dry period like a lungfish, but the eggs will colonize and just have new individuals, but they'll really bounce back and forth from, when there is water, there'll be lots of them. When there isn't water, they'll go away and just survive as eggs. Migration is another example. So the birds, a lot of temporary wetlands are used by a lot of different types of birds, and they'll come in and when there is water, they'll fly there, but as the water goes away, they just go fly and find another wetland. So there's a lot of different strategies that these systems, or the organisms, are using in these different systems. But a lot of people are really concerned about temporary wetlands because they are there's a lot of disease vectors that we find in them. So, these are huge insect ponds, right? So insect ponds are really driving a lot of the diseases. And, the question is, why would a mosquito want to inhabit temporary water? Well, there's extremely abundant systems, right? They're oftentimes close to humans and close to their food sources. So the mosquito needing blood males, and what we see is there's a lot of really interesting research about how to eradicate these diseases. We don't really think about it, but North America used to have malaria, right? We're probably thinking malaria will come back as we get warmer temperatures up north, and that Anopheles mosquito can make it up. But through the use of DDT and a lot of habitat destruction, the United States got rid of malaria from at least its mainland habitat, right? Right now, Brazil, they will clear a kilometer around a city, they will clear a kilometer around it to try to prevent the malaria mosquitoes from being there. And what they're really trying to do is balance this habitat protection versus human well-being. Does clearing a kilometer of forest around every town, is that a good thing? Probably not. But for the people there, I think you're going to have a hard time telling them that you need to have a forest around your property when it's going to be malaria for them. So temporary wetlands, I think, are really cool habitats, and you should definitely take a look at them. And yeah, that is the rest of the lecture. So I hope you enjoyed them, and be sure to look out for everything on the Canvas website, and I might be posting more videos here on YouTube. We'll see.